Welcome back to Sunday Live. We're speaking now with Dr. Alex Awiti, looking through the education crisis and which way forward is the question that we're posing. It's been close to 2 decades. For those young ones who don't know, this has been happening since the 90s, and we can remember in 1994, bitterly contested pay increase between the Moi government and teachers. It's been continuing over the years. There's almost a sense that each government, each sitting regime has pushed the problem to the next regime. We haven't dealt with it. We are here now. It almost feels like this is a tipping point, Alex. Yeah. So, which way forward?
Well, you know, as you rightly point out, this has been kind of kicking the can down the road, and no government has been bold enough to decisively deal with this thing. I think in many dimensions it's a political problem and it's all question of inconvenience. But I think at the heart of it is that we have an opportunity now to get out of the weeds and begin to look at the broader questions and the implication of our spending, our current levels of spending vis-a-vis the outcomes that we're getting out of education.
So Uhuru touched on this, and he said that 1.5% of the population currently consumes 52% of taxes. He's talking about the money that goes into the wage bill. He says it's not sustainable. I think the figure he gave was 61% is what it would be if we effected the pay hike. So what kind of analysis do we need to do, and what transformation do you think we need to see?
Well, I think these numbers are all over the map, and the president talked about several numbers. He said, well, the global optimal is about 35%, that we shouldn't be spending more than 35% of our domestic revenues on wages, and currently we're at 52%. That means that only 48% is free to do other things like paying our debts and maintaining the economy. Right. I think that is a very interesting point, but I think we need to go beyond that and ask the right questions about the priorities that we have today. But one of the things that we get ourselves caught into is that about 85% of the cost of education is teacher salaries. And as we know right now, the teacher-pupil ratio is about 1 to 50 in primary school and about 1 to maybe 35 in secondary school. So again, as you can see, we still have too few teachers for the number of students that we have. And mind you, over 2 million kids are out of school. Right. Not in kids of primary school age were not in school. So that means if these 2 million kids showed up, we'd need more teachers, we need more schools, we need more infrastructure. Has
to be said that the situation increased since the advent of pre-primary education. Yeah. We've seen a lot more children going into the schooling system, which is very important. But let's talk about quality of education, because in a sense he touched on that as well. Are we building a generation who are capable of being world-class? With this kind of spend, should we be taking a look at the training of teachers, so even as they demand higher salaries, their training and their delivery actually matches the salaries?
Well, I think there are many problems here. You know, my friend John Mugo from Uwezo, their organization has been putting out a lot of interesting data on education, especially reading and numeracy. One of the things they say is that kids in class 2 out of 3 of them cannot read at the level of kids in class 3. 2 out of 3 of them cannot read to the level of kids in class 2.
Totally lost.
Totally lost. Yeah, so they cannot read. 2 out of 3 kids in class 3 cannot read to the level of a standard 2
So the required standard of a standard 2 student.
Yeah. And we recently saw the IUCA, the University Council of East Africa, and the East Africa Business Council report that said about 47% of Kenyan university graduates are not fit for employment. And those that are fit for employment are mediocre, as we've seen with the recent 9 lawyers who've been kicked out of legal practice, for instance, who cannot work in the judiciary anymore. Or we know doctors who do all kinds of atrocious things to patients. 30% of teachers in class 4 cannot score 40% in a math knowledge assessment test. So they're huge problems.
So you're saying the standards are actually shocking, and this is according to research that has been done.
Absolutely. And the president did say today that our teachers in public system are paid better than teachers in the private sector, and yet the standards and performance in the private sector are much better. But that's a very loaded statement. There are many other issues like teachers to pupil ratio, infrastructure, the level of preparedness of these kids. They come from much better families where their parents can send them to private schools. So there are the huge issues in there. But that by itself throws out a new dimension to this debate of, are we getting the bang on the buck?
So, I mean, must be said as well, there's a problem of a skills gap, a huge skills gap, and that we need to make sure our curriculum meets the needs of the market, and there's already a disconnect existing, which is a whole other issue.
Absolutely.
Let's come back to the president and he stated the government has been investing in education. He went through a whole load of different areas, including electrification of primary schools. He says 95 done, 5% will be done in a short while. He says the spend has moved from 31 billion shillings to 42 billion shillings. But if you were seated with the president, and there's every chance he's watching right now, what advice would you give him? A lot has been invested, but now, what next?
Well, I think that's the big question. I think it's very, very difficult to draw direct correlations between how much you spend in education and what gets out of at the other end of the tailpipe. Partly because it is exceedingly complicated. For instance, we know that stunting in the population is over 40%, and that impairs significantly cognitive capacity of kids. And if the incidence of stunting is for 5% among the general population, and most of these kids will be the ones going to public schools, then it means that most of them actually show up in school incapable of learning. So there are many, many other issues. So I always say that this question of education, how much money we're putting into it, and what we expect at the end of their term in school, whether you're talking about class 8 or form 4, is a wicked problem. And we need to really exhaust, in terms of investigation, all the dimensions of the problem. And I would ask the president right now that he has a historic moment right now to take the lead out of this thing and lead in a much more robust, comprehensive conversation about public spending and government priorities, education being the key of them. How much are we spending, how much should we be spending, should depend on a more methodic assessment of the needs of our society going forward in terms of human skill and capability. I think that's the debate that we need to get into now. I think the question about whether teachers can or should be paid is a separate issue, and that has to be dealt with appropriately. But I think the bigger question that begs Uhuru Kenyatta to deal with right now is to look at the fundamental structure of government and how we are spending on key priorities. And I think education and health are key priorities that we must spend on appropriately if we are to be ready for a 21st century globalized knowledge economy.
Thank you. Fascinating, Alex. Thank you for that. We've got some clips of the president speaking. He's talking about the reasons why the pay hike cannot be effected, and also asking teachers not to hold students at ransom. Let's have a look.
It is important to point out that of the Kenya shillings 1.1 trillion collected in revenue last year, Kenya shillings 568 billion went to pay our wages, meaning that 1.5% of our population consumed 52% of all taxes raised. Our debt, our maintenance, and our essential public services, as well as our development, must be paid for out of the remaining 48%. Fellow Kenyans, if the award were paid to teachers, the Salaries and Remuneration Commission would have no choice and would be forced to harmonize wages across the entire public sector. And based on last year's tax revenue, our wage bill would therefore rise from 52% to 61% of all revenues collected.
There, the president speaking earlier this evening. Alex, my final question, is this the tipping point? Must this look at the full picture, the holistic picture, happen now?
Okay, the bad news to the president is that he has to continue spending on education, because we are woefully understaffed in terms of the teachers that we have in our schools. There's too many kids who are out of school. I know teachers are not appropriately trained. So we need to pump in more money to revamp the education system and to make it more effective in delivering the kinds of skills that we need. So the tipping point now is for Uhuru to step back out of all this noise and begin to show leadership in terms of where he wants to take the country forward on key priorities that build the foundation for our future. That's the tipping point.
Thank you, Alex, for that. And very interesting, Alex, Dr. Alex Awiti, expanding the perspective and saying, look, it's not just about teachers' pay. There's the whole issue of teachers' training, the relevance of our curriculum, access to schools for students, but also the ability for students to learn. Children with stunted growth can't learn appropriately in school. So much more we need to be talking about, and the spend on education can simply not maybe be capped.
It can't be contained.
Is the world. It can't be contained. Thank you for joining us on Sunday Live. We're taking a break. Back with much more.
Thank you.